One of the most beautiful things about the art of portrait painting is that we don't always have to do everything the exact same way every single time. It's not about following the rules, it's about understanding the principles behind the rules. Here we have our model Gabby, and I'm going to keep an image of her to the top left corner of your screen so you can refer to it as the painting develops. Alright, I'm going to start off by listing off the colors that I'll be using today. So starting from the top left corner, I have lead white, burnt umber, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, yellow ochre, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. And the canvas that I'm working on is an 11 by 14 inch linen canvas toned with burnt umber oil paint. And of course I let that dry over several days before starting this painting. And if at any point in this video you are curious as to what brands I'm using and what specific materials I'm using, all of that information will be typed up for you in the description box of this video. So if you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, just go ahead and scroll down in the description box and it'll all be typed up for you. So we're starting off with color this time. And so we're mixing up basically a ground flesh tone or a basic flesh tone. So we're using just cadmium red and burnt umber to start off with and neutralizing it and raising the value with the lead white. Now we've just dappled into the yellow ochre to raise a little bit of the warmth of this color. So now we're going to bring it down just a tad bit with a tiny touch of sap green. And I'm going to apply a little bit of medium onto my brush, and that medium is Neo McGilp. And again, just go ahead and scroll down in the description box below and you'll see exactly what medium I'm using. And so we're going to start off in a very different fashion than any other painting video that I've done for you. And the purpose of this demonstration is to show you that you don't have to follow any specific rules. It's not the rules, rather, it's the principles that determine the outcome of the painting. And so for the past few videos, I've been creating transfer drawings and then transferring them, underpainting them, and all that. And the ones before that, of course, if you've seen my previous videos, I would start off with a drawing color and then draw from there. This time, we're turning things over. We're basically flipping it onto its head and starting off with a ground color, as you notice. And now we're going to go in with a drawing color. So we're starting off the drawing. Instead of starting it off with the outside shape like we usually do, we're starting off with the angle of the eyes. So as you can tell, we're just using burnt umber and painting right on top of that flesh tone that we made. So that flesh tone is going to serve as a ground, kind of like a local flesh tone that we're going to build on top of. So right now we're establishing the most important angle for the portrait. In my opinion, the most important angle is the angle between the two eyes, and this angle takes a while to figure out. Sometimes it's a little too high, sometimes it's a little too low. In this case, the angle is very, very slight. So she's almost not at an angle at all. So what you're basically seeing is me trying to figure out the placement of the eye sockets, just using that angle between the two eyes, placing the two eyes, and then I'm going to build from here. And we're just using burnt umber oil paint. So again, we're going directly into color and we're drawing directly onto the canvas. And I will say, for composition's sake, if you're concerned about the composition of your painting, you really should do a transfer drawing or some kind of preliminary drawing. But in this case, I'm working on a canvas that's a little bit larger than the canvas that I would want. So this is an 11 by 14 inch canvas that I'm drawing on. And in fact, I would want the final painting to be on a 9 by 12. So if I place the head anywhere I don't want it to be placed, I'll just take it off the stretchers and re-stretch it onto a 9 by 12 stretcher bar, no problem. So we're starting off again with the angle between the two eyes. We've established where the two eyes are going to fit, and now we are placing the bottom of the nose and the top of the hairline. And here is our little caliper here. So this distance here roughly equals that distance. So those distances that I pointed out to you are relationships, and they thus are proportions. Remember, a proportion is just a relation from one thing to another thing. Now then, the angle between the eyes, I could have placed that anywhere, because one point in space can be anywhere in space. And so it only then became, where does the bottom of the nose fit in relation to the distance between the two eyes? And so that is a relationship that needs to be understood. And I'm pretty much doing that by eye right now. But the forehead, remember, the distance from the top of the forehead to the eyebrows is roughly 1/3, and the eyebrows to the nose is also roughly 1/3. And go ahead and measure that on your model or your photo reference or whatever you're working on before placing down the top of the forehead or the bottom of the nose. And again, I'm going to emphasize that it's really a matter of following and understanding the principles and not necessarily the rules. And of course, I may sound like I'm going to contradict myself because I'm seen by many as a teacher, and teachers oftentimes will follow one strict regimen. You must do this, you must do that, and therefore your outcome will be exactly this. And I'm turning that on its head because I'm trying to show you that you can follow the principles involved. And let's just talk about the principles as I'm drawing these shapes in there. Basically, the proportion of the distance of the bottom of the nose in relationship to the angle of the eyes is a proportion, and therefore it is a relationship between the eyes to the nose and a relationship from the nose to the forehead. Those are relationships that you can categorize as the principles, but the rules would have been do your preliminary drawing and figure out the outside shape and then place down specifically where you want things to go, albeit going from general to specific. I'm pretty much starting off specific. I'm trying to get specificity very, very early on. And I encourage you to do this kind of thing sometimes. If you've been painting for a while, or if you're just trying to figure out how to paint, just try a variety of different approaches. You can try whatever approach you want to, so long as you follow the principles. And don't worry, I'll talk about the principles as I lay them down. So another principle that we're going to talk about now as we're filling in the shadow shape is basically maintaining light and shadow. And so light and shadow and proportion are going to be the two fundamental principles that we're going to figure out pretty early on in this painting. So remember, we started off with the angle of the eyes, very different to the videos that I've created before. Just the angle of the eyes, place the two eyes in their relative positions, and then go ahead and place the bottom of the nose and the forehead. Now here's where the center line is going to be important, because as you know, the center line divides the two sides of the face. And that center line is going to be important, especially when you're trying to fit the nose in the relatively correct position. So that's why I have these shapes very simple, but I'm trying to make them very specific. And so the nose, the shadow shape of the nose, is also indicating to me where the center line is in relationship to the model. And at the same time now, we're going to start to use a little bit of the lead white, some of the yellow ochre, and a tad bit of alizarin crimson. And so yellow ochre and lead white can create a pretty strong and luminous yellowish flesh tone, but we just tinted it with a little bit of the alizarin crimson. And alizarin crimson is a very good warm dark red for tinting. You can tint your darks with alizarin crimson, and you can also tint your lights. And so now we're starting to put in some indications of the planes. And so we figured out where we want the eyes to fit in relationship to one another. And now we're going in and describing the large and simple plane. See, this corner right here is the side of the eye socket. And here we're just flattening out that shape, kind of working from general to specific, but we're trying to be as specific as we can, as early as we can, so that we can build a pretty much a faster painting in this way. And again, it's not a matter of the rules, but rather the principles. And so we're starting off with a little combination of lead white and ivory black to create a nice, pretty much a cool gray. And we're using that for the sclera. Now, I oftentimes will tell you that the sclera is not white. And that is not a rule, that's a principle. Sclera is usually not bright white. Even though I used it, the principle that I'm talking about when I say the sclera is not white is the principle of tone, the principle of value. If the sclera was bright white, that would mean it'd be the lightest thing on the value scale on your canvas. And what is the lightest thing when you're outside on a bright and sunny day? The brightest thing is the sun. And is the sclera as bright as the sun? No, it's not. It really isn't. And so it's a matter of value. So value is going to be the next principle that we want to understand. Now the rule states figure out exactly where your light and shadow fits, and then start to modulate the value. Now that's a really helpful way to create a painting. And trust me, I've made several paintings that way and it works, just figuring out your light and shadow before putting in the tone. But again, I'm trying to show you that you don't have to follow one specific regiment to create a painting. And so we're starting to indicate our value changes quite early on, but we're making sure that the shapes are in the relative correct proportion in relation to one another, and we're making sure that the principle of light and shadow is relatively correct. And we're basically going and drawing in the irises with color. We're just going in there with color. And as long as these shapes are in their relative correct position and the values are relatively in the correct location, we should start to develop an image very soon. So now we're going in with a little bit of a darker value for the junction between the upper eyelid and the eye. And it's very hard to see on the photo reference. I was actually kind of pretty far away from the model when I took this picture, but that's all right. It's very much about understanding what you're looking at rather than copying it. And so these dark shapes here are a result to the relative position that these shapes are in relation to the light. Notice this little corner right here is a little bit darker because the upper eyelid is rolling inwards towards the eye, and thus it's turning away from the light source. And now we just added a little touch of our cadmium red so we can get the little warmth of the little fleshiness in this area of the eye. And now we're going to get a little bit of a cooler color, just combining these two colors on the palette. Let's just add in a little bit of flesh tone just to neutralize it. Maybe let's make it a little more pink. So we added a little bit more cadmium red to that mixture, and let's just create this little dark accent down here. So we're pretty much drawing with paint. We're sculpting out the painting with paint. And we're basing everything off of the eyes. And already, as you can tell, the portrait is fitting a little bit too far to the right on the canvas for a conventional composition that's a little closer to centered. Uh-oh, big mistake, right? Not really, because I do intend to cut the linen canvas off of the stretchers and put it onto a smaller canvas if I want to show this painting or anything like that. And if I don't want to show this painting, then I'll just leave it as is. But it's also a pretty much a classical thing to resize or restretch your canvases just to change up the composition. So don't worry. The head is going to be a little closer to the right, closer to my palette, but the composition can be saved if I want to. I can just put it on a different stretcher that's smaller and then just make the head a little bit more centered. But in any case, now you've just seen a little bit of the lighter planes that we've indicated. Remember, a plane change is indicated by a value change. And so this plane right here on the forehead is facing the light a little bit more than the area, say, to the left relative to your screen. And so the colors that we used to make that lighter flesh tone were nothing more than lead white, yellow ochre, and maybe a tad bit of the cadmium red. And so we're painting the planes in relationship to our understanding of the form. And again, in principle, the shapes that are lighter are most light facing, meaning that the planes, the angle between the planes are closer to perpendicular if you're at an area that's lighter, and closer to parallel if you're in an area that's, say, in shadow. And if you look at the angle of the cast shadow um, on the side of her eye, so that is the eye to the left of your screen, you can pretty much notice right away where the light source is coming from. So that can also help guide your value gradation. So now we're just softening some of the edges here with a little halftone. So we're just going to soften this little edge right about here. And I'm using round brushes. I've been using round brushes a little bit more frequently just because I can get a fine point with them. And notice how I'm switching between brushes as well. So I switched to this brush, and this is kind of like my designated dark brush, or my designated shadow brush. Now I'm painting in this dark concavity for the bottom of the eye socket. That little area there is facing the light a little bit less, so it's a little bit darker. And now we're going to use a little bit of a lighter, more yellowish mixture to add the little glimpse of light that we see on the bottom of the lower eyelid just there. And remember, the highlights are the areas most perpendicular to the light source. Now let's just double check the angle of the eyes. The angle between the two eyes, we really want to make sure that those angles are correct. Now the distance of the forehead and the distance from the eyebrows to the nose. Now look at this distance. The distance between the eyes is usually equal to the length of one eye. Usually that's the case. But just make sure to go and check your model. Try and get close up and make sure you can objectively make those measurements. And if I went too fast, I'll repeat myself. The distance between the two eyes is roughly equal to the length of one eye, usually. Now the model is turned a little bit, so that may change that a tiny bit, but that's a general rule of thumb. And now the other rule that I was talking about is that the distance from the hairline to the eyebrows is roughly equal to the distance of the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose. Now we're starting to paint in the pretty much just the dark shapes on the bottom of the nose, just trying to place them down. Again, you have to start with something, right? And so we're combining a little bit of cadmium red and our lead white into this little puddle here, and just painting in this little plane on the side of the cheek. And again, I should say, if you have any concerns with using lead white, you don't have to use lead white. You can use something like titanium white, zinc white. Gamblin makes a flake white replacement. But the reason I use lead white is because it's a transparent white, which allows me to use more of it, but it also has a pretty heavy feel to it. So it's almost like I can sculpt with the lead white. Now, there are other transparent whites that you can use that are not lead white. You can use something like zinc white, or like I said, Gamblin has a flake white replacement, and flake white is, of course, just another version of saying lead white. So you don't have to use lead white if you don't want to. Now then, we're making the shadow a little bit cooler. We put a tad bit of ultramarine blue and some lead white into the shadow. Not too much white into the shadow, but just a little bit to bring the coolness of the ultramarine out. So here we're just getting a little bit more ultramarine into this mixture. And with color, you can compare the color changes on the shadow in relation to the color changes in the light, meaning that the hue of the shadow in general leans closer to bluish, and the hue on the flesh tones lean a little bit closer to maybe pinkish, yellowish. So you can kind of determine what colors to start off with just by comparing the hues to one another. And now we're going to get a little bit more warmth with this alizarin crimson, and we're going to make it a little darker by dappling into the darker mixtures on the palette. And now we're just trying to just kind of shape the side of the nose and at the same time create a halftone. So we're trying to shape the size of the side of the nose and at the same time create a halftone. And we're throwing in some alizarin crimson because remember, alizarin is a very good tinter. It's very good for tinting something, making something red-ish without making it too red. Now we're just going to take the paint that's on the brush basically and just create a little halftone here for the forehead. Now this flat shape that I painted in a value is a plane change, and it should be fairly easy to see that it is a plane change and therefore it's getting darker, and you can already see that it's starting to create a little bit of form on the little sliver of the forehead that we can see, and we're going to just take that and apply it to the side plane of the cheek to the left of your screen. So again, we're trying to follow the form here as we're creating the painting. Now, I've never made a painting video like this, and I've hardly ever painted like this, but I just thought it would be a good little experiment to focus on this little triangle. Basically, the two eyes and then the bottom of the nose is the triangle that I'm talking about. And trying to focus on this little area the best I can, and then build the rest of the portrait based off of this. Here's another little plane change here for the side of the nose. Now this plane is very light facing, meaning the angle of that plane is very close to being perpendicular to the light source. And as we go further down the zygomatic region, that is as we get further down and closer to the cheekbones, it's not as light facing, but it's still pretty light facing. In this area right here, it's a little bit more pinkish, so we're throwing in a little bit more of a pinkish tone to this little basically side plane of the eye to the right of your screen. And now we're going to observe that there is a little light shape right about here on the top side of the tear duct of the eye to the right of your screen. And sometimes it's easier to see things that need to be corrected when you have color into the mixture. Sometimes that makes it more difficult because you're focusing on color maybe too much, and then things such as the outside shape of the eye socket may be forgotten or something like that. In that case, we're actually going to adjust the outside shape of the eye socket. So we're just going to cut this corner a little closer inward, trying to imagine the skull underneath of the shape, just trying to make sure that that little angle between these shapes here follows somewhat the anatomy of the underlying anatomical structure there. So now we're going to use a little vertical gesture to place the bottom nostril, and just a little bit of ultramarine blue and burnt umber should do the trick for this. And so we're just placing that shape in there, and we're going to use the same combination that I just mentioned for the pupil of the pupils of both eyes and the top plane of this little area here, just beneath the lower eyelid. So again, just ultramarine blue and burnt umber gives us a pupil. So now we have the pupil to the right of the screen, and now the pupil to the left of the screen. And remember, the iris is a pretty much ultramarine blue, ivory black, and lead white. Not a very difficult mixture, but I see that the shape of the left iris is a little strange, so I'm going to go ahead and try to adjust that shape. Again, I'm really trying to treat the paint as I would a pencil. So imagine if this was my pencil drawing. I'm pretty much treating it with the same level of specificity and observation. So just a little bit of lead white and ultramarine blue gives us the highlight. Remember, the highlight is the area that's most perpendicular to the light source. So these little highlights are pretty much right on her pupil, which means that the light is right onto her pupil, which means that she's staring at the light very closely. Now we have a little dark shape right here, a little halftone for the bottom of the wing of the nose. And now we're going to go in and place a little more light. Let's use a little vertical gesture right here. And we see that there's a highlight right there. So remember, that plane on the nose is now, we're now telling the viewer that that plane is most perpendicular to the light source. Again, we're thinking very three-dimensionally as we are painting with value. Value pretty much is all about your understanding of the form in 3 dimensions. And color is your understanding of the forms in relation to a given light source. Meaning that the light is fairly warm, so the shadows are fairly cool. Not always the case, but it's kind of the case in this painting. Last time we used natural light, so the light was a little bit cooler, the shadow was a little warmer, so this one's a little different. And now with a lighter flesh tone mixture, remember the lighter flesh tone mixture was pretty much just the lead white, burnt umber, cadmium red with a touch of yellow ochre. And again, with that mixture, we're just adjusting the cast shadow, making sure that it appears to, the cast shadow appears to be casted by the nose. Here we just painted in the root of the nose. All right, so now you can definitely tell that the strategy is very different to the previous paintings that I have been making. And this is the first really where I start off completely with the eyes and then figure everything else out based on the eyes. But that's what we're doing. We're changing the technique a little bit just to show you that it's not so much about following the rules, and it's more about understanding the principles involved in painting. And so now we're trying to work with the halftones. And again, the halftone region of the palette's pretty much just burnt umber, yellow ochre, a little bit of sap green for the halftones, and the light mixtures I explained before, pretty much just lead white, cadmium red, burnt umber, and a touch of yellow ochre. That's pretty much the majority. That's pretty much the mixture for the majority of the colors in the flesh tone. And we're just going to take from this little halftone region of the palette and just let the value drop a tiny bit as we roll away from the zygomatic region. So as we roll away from the cheekbone, so the planes of the cheekbone are facing the light a little more than the areas beneath them. As we approach the mouth, it does get a little darker as the planes start to turn away, but not that much. And so now we're going to observe the outside shape just beneath the cheekbone. And so this little angle right here. And so again, it's about understanding the principles, not necessarily following rules. And so right now I'm trying to understand the principle of proportion for the mouth. So I'm going to use this little relationship here. So this shape from the eyebrow to the bottom of the eye is roughly the root of the nose to the middle of the mouth, roughly speaking. But nevertheless, it's still a principle. That is the principle of proportion. And so now we're going to place in the little shape there, and now we're going to double check that. Again, this isn't a conventional measurement. It's just something to get me started with figuring out where these shapes need to fit in relation to one another. And now we're going to use a vertical plumb line. So the corner of the side of the pupil, basically, so a horizontal from the pupil down kind of gives us the corner of the mouth, and the same thing with the other side. Again, not always the case, and in this case I think I kind of messed up. I think it needs to go a little further to the right. Let's use a little diagonal from the nostril to the side of the mouth. And again, it's alright to make a mistake. Mistakes are alright. Just know how to keep track of the shapes that you're placing down and how to relate those shapes in relation and how to relate those shapes to one another. And so now again we're using the eyes to help us place everything else. So now here we have the little bottom for the mouth, and again my drawing color here is burnt umber. So I'm just using burnt umber oil paint to figure out where to place the mouth. And so now we're going to double check again with the T-square, with our little magic T-square. We're going to make sure that these points are matching up in relation to the model. So let's double check this corner here. That looks about right. Maybe a little further out here. Yeah, just maybe a little further to the left. So again, it's basically like the saying, measure twice, cut once. In this case, I'll say maybe measure 5 times and then paint in the mouth. Just be sure that you know how to relate these shapes to one another. And again, I based it all on the eyes. Remember, I used the distance from the eyebrow to the bottom of the eye to give me the root of the nose to the bottom of the mouth. And then I used basically the pupils of the eyes to give me the corners of the mouth. And even the angle of the mouth itself, though I didn't use any measurement for the angle of the mouth, I'm still eyeballing it relative to the angle of the eyes. Now you can see how everything is being constructed based on the eyes. So now we're just painting in a little half tone right here for the side of the mouth. We're starting to create the orbicularis oris, fancy name for saying the structure encompassing the mouth, meaning that this darker shape here is angling further away from the light. Remember, any value change that you see is basically indicating a plane change in relation to the light, and that is an angle change, so the angle of the plane in relation to the angle of the light. So now we're starting off with the dark of the lips, and so we have just a simple combination of burnt umber and alizarin crimson for the dark of the mouth. And alizarin crimson is a very nice color to use for sneaking warmth into your dark tones. And so you'll find that I usually use alizarin crimson to sneak a tad bit of warmth into, say, the connection between the upper lip and the lower lip, and even the side of the lip here. There's quite a bit of alizarin crimson into this mixture. Again, alizarin is a really nice tinting color. It can tint something reddish without the strength of your cadmium red or your whichever bright red you're using. And so now when you want that strength, you can combine, of course, your cadmium red with your flesh tones, which is what I did for this little shape that I'm painting in here, this dark light, as we're approaching the shadow of the mouth. Remember, the dark light is the value in the light just as light turns into shadow. And that's what we're painting right now. And we're just trying to get a understanding of the forms as well as the color. Now the overall placement of the mouth, remember that was the most important thing at first in the beginning. So the principle of proportion had to be understood to the best of our knowledge, really. And now we're basically using a very simple combination of our alizarin crimson mixed into the flesh tones that we had. And as you notice, I tend to mix a lot of colors on top of each other on the palette. And so that helps me create uh, on the palette a type of kind of harmony uh, as opposed to just mixing all the puddles separately without letting them touch one another. Instead, on the palette, you can see that a lot of the colors kind of blend into one another, and some regions of the palette, such as the one I just took this bit of paint off of, are pretty much kept lighter in value so that I can reach out to them very quickly without having to mix every color uniquely with every single passage of paint. And now we're just working the edge between the side of the mouth and the side plane of the orbicularis oris. Remember, the orbicularis oris is just a fancy way of saying the structure that encompasses the mouth. And now we're changing the hue a little bit, and we're making the hue a little more green as we approach the bottom of the lower lip. And then, of course, we just threw in a nice little dark, warm red to contrast with the green that we're painting right about here. And for that, I'm using quite a bit of sap green in these mixtures. And then for the darker reds, I'm using quite a bit of alizarin crimson. Remember, I usually tend to say alizarin crimson and sap green are two colors that were basically made for each other. So now there's a little lighter plane right here, and we're kind of contrasting the hue a little bit. We're throwing it closer to the greenish side. And so this plane right here is very similar to the color of the tone of the canvas. And so we're just going to adjust a little value here and create a little gradation of tone. Pretty much just taking a value right from the palette. And now here it's a little bit warmer, a little bit darker, and a little bit closer to the yellowish side as we're adjusting the edge of the bottom side of this plane. Remember, each value change that I paint is a change in the plane's position relative to the light source, with the exception of local values that may be darker than others. So what's a local value? So a local value is an area to which their local value is different than, say, the local value of another region. So to make that more clear, look at the local value of the mouth in relation to the local value of the flesh tones. So the value, let's go into black and white for a second here. The value of the mouth, the local value, meaning the average value of the flesh tones on the mouth, are darker than the flesh tones basically in the skin. Now that's not always the case, but in this case it is. So let's go back into color so you can see that the value change in the mouth, the overall average value should be a little bit darker. So now it's a little vertical gesture here. We're placing in a little dark shape for the accent on the corner of the side of the mouth. Now a little dark accent here. And remember to sneak a little bit of warmth in between these dark accents between the lips. And again, I like to use alizarin crimson. You can use alizarin permanent too, or any other kind of transparent red to tint these darker values closer to the warmish side. So that is a warm-ish side. And so now we're filling in the bottom plane of the orbicularis oris. And now we're painting in the lighter planes for the bottom lip using our lead white and our cadmium red. A little more cadmium red, just a little more to bring some more warmth into the bottom lip. Very small amounts of cadmium red into that mixture, but just enough to get that warmth through. And now we're using a little bit of a combination of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson to get a little more of a velvety type, kind of off purple-ish tone. Very much just manipulating the colors there. I just wanted there to be a little bit more of a purple-ish color on the side. Now we're just again reworking that edge here. So we want this edge to be fairly sharp, but not overly sharp either. So we're also considering the edge quality of each little shape that we're painting in here. And now let's get a little more burnt umber and a tad bit of sap green and a tiny bit of ultramarine blue mixed right on top of this area of the palette. And now we're going to see that there's the value right here on the bottom is just a little bit darker. Remember the form encompassing the mouth, the orbicularis oris. Now we're going to look at the corner of the mouth to the middle of the mouth to the left and compare it to the right. Now remember the model is in 3/4 view, so we're going to be seeing a little bit more of the model's right side. So the right side of her face, we're going to be seeing a little more of that than the other side. So let's use this measurement here, top of the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose, and now compare it from the bottom of the nose down to where the chin should be. Notice the chin is just a little bit lower. See that? The chin is just a little bit lower than that measurement we made. And that's what you call specificity. And that's how you gain specificity, by relating each proportion to one another. Now let's look at the philtrum. This little area here is the philtrum, and compare it to the bottom of the lower lip, just to kind of get a relation. But this point that we placed in there is a very important point, and it again relates to proportion. Again, we're following the principles here, not so much the rules. So the proportion is really what counts in terms of placing the shapes in the relative correct position. Now we're going to pretty much eyeball the outside shape. I'm very much looking at the distance between the corner of the mouth to the right of your screen relative to the outside shape of the face. It's a very small distance since the model is in 3/4 view. So now here we're just going to continue the outline of the chin. There's a little definitive shape right about here. So again, we're just trying to check that center line. And now we're going to just place a little angle right about here. Again, double checking the center line. And now just a little angle change here. Just want to make sure that that angle is just right. Now we're going to use the corner of the side of the nose, relating that to the mouth. And now we're going to see that the neck must be somewhere about here. So we're kind of eyeballing it first. Now we're going to very definitively measure where that goes using a vertical plumb line. So we're going to bring in our little magic T-square. And so again, the nostril must match up on a vertical in relation to the neck, just based on our model that we're looking at. And so after making that measurement, I see that I'm not that far off, but I think that that line needs to move a little closer to the left, but only a tiny bit. So we're just going to just move the line just a tiny bit. And even so, just making the line thicker, so that the line matches up with the vertical in relation to the nostril is pretty much all we need. And that's the kind of specificity that we really want to obtain, especially with a portrait painting. Now let's use the halftone mixture. This halftone is pretty much a very simple combination of burnt umber, yellow ochre, and perhaps a little bit of the colors on the palette. That is the colors that we used for the basic flesh tone, which was, remember, cadmium red, lead white, and burnt umber with a touch of yellow ochre. Add the burnt umber and sap green mixture to that, and you pretty much have this color that I'm using to paint in these halftones. So what I'm doing is I'm figuring out the boundary of the shadow shape. That is the boundary between the light and shadow. I'm trying to figure that out using the halftone. Now again, you don't always have to do everything the same way. For the past many videos, I figured out the shadow shape using a line instead of a tone. But this time I'm using a tone, and more specifically, I'm using a half tone that is already in the relative hue that I want for the actual flesh tone. So again, you do not have to follow any one specific way of working, so long as you know the principles. And the principle that we're working on right now is value. And at the same time, we're creating a boundary between light and shadow. So now we just used a little bit of alizarin crimson and a tad bit of cadmium red, some lead white, and then some burnt umber all together on top of the mixture that was already on the palette. And now we're going to be painting in the lighter planes right around this little corner. So I perceive this area to be a little more pinkish. So we're a little closer to the pinkish side there. So let's add a little bit more pink. Pretty much just taking the colors that we used for the lips basically and just kind of blending them into the area of the chin here. And so here is a little dark shape right about here. We're going to have a little, so remember this is following the center line, just a little divot here, a little bit of a darker shape. Again, let's just think of these regions of color as just shapes. Now this shape here is a little bit darker as it approaches the bottom of the chin, and therefore the light is getting diminished as it rolls away from the light source. So here we have a little more lead white into this mixture, and again we're thinking about the angles of the planes in relation to the light source, and we're also using a little bit more pinkish hue into these combinations. So this area is still a little pinkish, not terribly pink, but a little pinkish. And let's see, let's use a little bit more. So just mixing the same puddle again on the palette and just spreading the tone. And we're creating the form of the chin with this mixture. And we're kind of following the form, just like you would with a graphite pencil, trying to follow the form as you lay in the tones. Now we're going to switch to a different hue and a different value. So we're going to be using yellowish mixture, so the lead white with the yellow ochre, so a yellowish hue and a little bit lighter. So the value is going to be a little bit lighter here because this area is a tad bit more light facing than the chin is. And let's just soften the transition between these two shapes. Very light touch should do the trick. Now let's get into a little more of the lead white, just lead white into that mixture that we already had, and let's create a little highlight. And now with a fairly used up, I believe size 4 filbert brush, we're going to actually push the outside shape a little closer to the left. I kind of messed up with the outside shape, so I'm just going to push that shape a little bit further to the left. I think that's where it should be, but I'm not entirely sure. But I'm going to guess that that shape was a little bit too far to the right of your screen. But again, I could be wrong. That's just how I perceive that shape fits. And it's kind of hard to objectively measure an outside shape. But let's show you something that you can measure to give you the width of the head. So let's use our little caliper here again. So again, let's adjust the caliper. So the eyebrows to the chin. Okay, so the eyebrows to the chin in relation to the width of the head is going to be a very useful relationship. Again, not always the case, but just look for relationships or patterns within the portrait so that you can gain greater degree of accuracy. So we used a height to width comparison. So a height to width comparison is using a distance of the height that we are confident of, that is the eyebrows to the bottom of the chin. And again, let's double check it. So here's the height measurement right here, and let's compare it to the width measurement right about here. They're very close to being the same on the photo reference, and I think that the width is a tiny bit greater, so I just moved it with the brush a little bit further out to the left of your screen. Just a tiny little change there. And now we're making a point for the ramus of the jaw. So that is the little curve of the side of the jaw. And now we're connecting it to the bottom of the jawbone, thus giving us a little mandible shape right here. So we want to make sure that we have the mandible in the relative correct position. And that little outline that we painted in there should be enough to describe pretty much the boundaries of the forms. So now with a simple combination of our burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and a tad bit of lead white, we're starting to mix onto the bottom region of the palette. And there are a few warm colors in this mixture, so there's a little bit of alizarin in there in this little mix. Remember, alizarin is a pretty good reddish tint color. And so this area of the form shadow of the side of the face is a little bit, I want to say, cooler in relation to the colors of the flesh in the light. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the temperature of the shadow in relation to the temperature of the light. So you can see there's quite a bit more influence from the ultramarine blue into this mixture, but there's also burnt umber. So ultramarine blue is pretty blue. It's a pretty deep blue, but it can be neutralized and darkened a little bit with burnt umber. So oftentimes having burnt umber and ultramarine blue in your palette is a very good way to go. Now usually I've been using raw umber instead of burnt umber, and that's because I've been building my paintings with underpaintings. But usually if I'm going to work directly in this way, I kind of use burnt umber a little bit more. Alright, so now we've added a little bit of alizarin crimson, or a little bit more alizarin crimson into the combination of colors. So this is pretty much alizarin crimson combined with the ultramarine blue and the burnt umber. So the alizarin crimson, again, makes a very nice and deep red-ish color. And here's the thing. So the shadow side is both warm and cool. So there's a little conundrum right there. What are you going to do if your colors are both warm and cool? Well, of course, let's just talk about the way that we're approaching it now. So we're approaching it with direct painting. So we're trying to get the color as quickly as possible. So what I'm actually doing is I'm using a little bit of the tone of the canvas underneath. So the tone is a little bit warmer. So you see that I'm letting some of the warmth of the some of the warmth of the tone of the canvas show through the shadow side. And the cooler colors are being painted on while still leaving traces of the canvas. You can kind of see on the bottom, directly below where I'm painting here, that I have left some of the canvas to show through. And we're going to introduce a little bit of hue variation right on this side of the zygomatic region. So this side of the cheekbone that's in shadow, we're actually going to change the hue and make it a little more on the greenish side. So we're using a little bit more sap green and ultramarine blue into the mixtures right about here. And now we're going to start to dapple into the dark light. Now remember, the dark light is one of the most important values in the light, and it is the light just as light turns into shadow. But in any case, at this point, we're trying to change the hue a little bit on the corner of the cheekbone that's in shadow. And as we gradate towards the light, notice we're starting to paint in a little bit of a warmer hue, but the value is very carefully thought out because the value has to be the darkest light within the light, just as before light turns into shadow, and that really describes the journey that the values are making as they roll across the side of the face and describe the form. Notice that we're adding a little bit of a warmer tone, a warmer hue for the dark light there, and now we're going to start to draw in the neck. So the side of the neck. So we're going to look at the relationship between the side of the face. So that is the side of the face to the left of your screen. And make sure that we draw the neck in as accurately as we can. So again, we're just looking at the angles. So the relationship between the angles. Notice how I just used the brush there to kind of eyeball the angle. Now again, remember we are building everything based on the eyes. Again, we're breaking some of the rules, but we're still trying to follow the principles involved in portrait painting. And again, this is a demonstration to show that you can break some rules and still create a very convincing image so long as you follow the principle. So now we're going to be, again, using the principle of proportion. So we're relating shapes to one another. Remember, a proportion is just a relation between shapes. And so these shapes that we're drawing in here, notice how I'm just using this little dry bristle brush as an eraser. These shapes here are being placed in relation to the shapes that we already established. Notice how we're using the brush here to create a diagonal. So you can extend one straight line across and see how it relates to your surrounding shapes. So this is much like, say that I'm giving you a statement. I give you 3 statements that are true. Now let's see if you can deduce another 3 statements based off of those statements. So that's what we're doing. We're starting off with the statements that we had previously, that is the angle of the eyes, the proportion to the nose and to the mouth, and then the values. And we're building the shapes of the neck on top of that. Now you can see a very simplified little shape here, this little triangular looking shape, and that shape is for the pretty much the side of the muscle of the neck. So that is the sternocleidomastoid. And this little corner right here is going to pretty much just be for the shoulder. You could call it the trapezius muscle, the neck muscle, or you can just call it the shoulder. So let's just call it the shoulder. So this angle right here is going to have a specific relation to the side of the jaw. So we're going to go ahead and look at that angle shortly, but right now we're just eyeballing the proportion. And we're going to draw a little bit of the outline of the shirt. And now we're going to relate that side to the other side. Again, we're going to relate these shapes using straight lines and angles. So here we have a straight line for the other side of the shoulder. And what I'm focusing on mostly is just making sure basically that the neck is not too long. I just want to make sure that the neck is not too long. It's very easy to make a neck too long. So we're going to go ahead and move that line up a little bit, and now we're going to use the dry bristle brush. So we're just using that brush to erase a little bit, thus moving the shoulder a little bit up because it did seem like it was too low. Now here we have a little bit of the outside shape of the cast shadow. So this is the outside shape of the cast shadow, that is the shadow being casted from the neck. And now we're going to go and draw the little corner of the side of the hair. Now this is not really part of the neck, but I'm just trying to look at these shapes as a whole. And now let's make a little vertical gesture here, and let's suppose that the clothing comes out to about there. So now we're going to go into some of the color mixtures that we're going to use for the neck, and particularly the form shadow of the neck. So we're going to start off with a cooler hue, but the value, it should be a little darker than the form shadow on the side of the face. So we're using our ultramarine, our burnt umber, and the lead white. And again, the lead white is a very good transparent white that allows you to use more of it, and it still has a very strong body, so you really do feel like you're sculpting with paint when you're using the lead white. But if you don't want to use lead white, it's perfectly fine to use titanium white or any other type of white. So now we're starting off with a greenish mixture, and it might be too saturated. So that is, it might be too bright of a green. So we're going to go into our ivory black and burnt umber to bring down the saturation of that green. And so it's kind of working, but I think we need a little bit more of the burnt umber ivory black mixture. So let's go ahead and place that shape in there. So this is the accent right here. So the accent is going to be the conjunction between two forms. So where two forms meet, you have an accent. So the connection between the jaw and the neck will give you a dark accent. And so now we're going to fill in this entire mass here with this color that we mixed up, and then we're going to build on top of that color. But for now, the statement that I'm telling you is that the color of the form shadow on the neck, so this area right here, is cooler in relation to the form shadow of the side of the face. So that is the statement that we're making, and of course the value is also darker than the form shadow on the side of the face. So now with a little soft sable brush, we're going to subtract a little bit of the paint. Remember, I was trying to let some of the underpainting show through just to have a little bit of warmth and still maintain the cool temperature of the shadow tone mixtures. So we're just trying to redefine the bottom of the jawbone here. Just making sure that that angle is as close to nature as we can possibly make it. That is, as close to the actual model's neck as we possibly can. And now with a little more sap green into the mixture, we're going to go further into the cooler tones. So again, kind of contrasting warm and cool flesh tone mixtures. So this area, we're going to perceive it to be a little bit closer to the greenish side. So let's just go ahead and fill that in there. Again, letting some of the tone of the canvas to show through. And remember, the canvas is toned with just burnt umber oil paint. Alright, so now we're just distributing a little bit of the color onto the cast shadow on the neck. Just a little more of an earthy green over here. Let's use a little bit of the lead white just to make this a little bit cooler and a little bit lighter. So there we go, just a little more lead white into this mixture. We're really trying to push the color change in this area. But again, we're trying to not make it overly saturated. It's easy to make the colors of the portrait overly saturated, but it's not always so easy to relate the colors and maintain a harmonious neutral balance. So now we're just making a little vertical gesture here and pushing that shape a little further to the right. So that is, it's always a little easier to oversaturate flesh tones, but it's not always as easy to relate harmonious neutrals to one another. So again, saturation is how bright something is, like a stop sign is overly bright, and a red apple is not as bright as a stop sign. So again, that's what saturation means. And now we're going into the dark lights as we're moving in towards the light. So right about here, we're just painting in the little shape for the neck muscle. So that is the sternocleidomastoid, if you want to get specific with the name, or you can just call it the muscle of the neck. And we're making the hues a little bit warmer, but still on the greenish side. So we're using quite a bit of our sap green into these mixtures. Again, sap green and alizarin crimson are pretty much colors that were made for each other. And so here we're just going to make that shape a little bit more flat. So we're painting it a little more opaque. In this area, I don't really want to let the tone of the canvas show through as much. So we're making the passage into the light a little bit more opaque. That is, we're using more paint. And just working these transitions. So there's a lighter plane right about here, and then as it approaches the neck muscle, it's getting a little bit darker, yet still in the shadow. Let's get a little bit of the mixture here that was already on the palette. So this is a warmer and lighter tone. And let's just say that's going to be the beginning of the dark light for the neck. And now you know at this point what the dark light is. And if you don't, again, let's reiterate, the dark light is the value in the light just as light approaches shadow. And it's the most important value when it comes to describing the curvature of the form. That is the curve that you're making as you're approaching the light. And just adding in a little halftone right here for the pit of the neck. You could also call this area the suprasternal notch. So that's kind of the little connection between your two collarbones. Or you can say your clavicles if you want to get more specific. So let's get a little bit of yellow and ochre mixture into this area here. But that might be too bright, so let's go a little bit lower on the palette. And just taking what's on the palette that's a little bit darker and a little bit warmer. Now we're starting to move our way from the shadows. And you can already tell with these values that we've placed, so that is the dark lights that we're painting in there, the neck already starts to look like it's turning in space, even though we still have yet to paint anything in the light side, which is what we're going to be doing now. So we're combining the red, so the cadmium red, our burnt umber, our yellow ochre, and of course our lead white. And now we're going to start to add in some of the lights for the light region of the neck. So these are the lightmost facing areas. Now on the photo reference, this area looks pretty yellow, and I would say that the photo reference might be pushing the saturation a little further than it would be in nature. So we aren't going to be copying from the photograph. We're going to be instead extrapolating the information that it's giving us, which is that it's telling us that these planes are more light facing. But the photograph may be wrong in telling us that it's that yellow in this area here, where in fact it should be a little closer to a neutral yellow pinkish. So again, let's just take from the palette here. So this area right below the neck, so this portion of the shoulder is still in light, but it's not as light facing as the neck itself. So that's another important plane change that we need to take into account. So now with a little more lead white and yellow ochre, we're going to start to paint in that light that I was talking about. So this plane right here is much more light facing than the shoulder. So again, just making these plane changes as evident as I possibly can. Now let's take from the halftone region of the colors on the palette, and let's just clarify this edge right about here. It's not quite as sharp, so we just softened it just a little bit. And now let's just take from the darker area of the palette. Switching brushes here, we're going to go back to the shadow. So we're actually going to use a combination of color to adjust the edge. So we're just making this edge a little bit softer as it approaches the neck and sharper as it approaches the chin to try to bring a little more focus towards the center of the face. So that is, we're sharpening the edges as you approach the center of the face to bring more focus to the face. And let's just take a little bit more from the half-tone region of the palette, and again, let's just make this transition a little softer so the chin is approaching the shadow, and so it's getting darker, but we want that edge to be a little bit softer and this edge to be sharper right about here because it's the cast shadow, and we want to pull focus towards the center of the face. And let's just soften this little transition here just by pretty much taking the colors we had on the palette and just make this plane change between the neck and the shoulder evident but not quite as obvious. So this is how we build the subtlety. Remember, subtlety in value is just making the values as close as you can to one another yet still maintain their differentiation. And so now we're going to establish the top of the forehead, and we're going to follow the principle of proportion. Remember, we're breaking rules, but we're following the proportions. So again, the eyebrows to the bottom of the nose are roughly 1/3, and the top of the hairline to the eyebrows are roughly another third. And again, try and get as close as you can to your model that you're working with, and make these observations as evident as possible. Make these decisions based on what you are observing. And so with that being said, we did move our initial mark a little bit higher up because we had the forehead a little bit too small. And so now right about here, we're going to be creating the boundary of the hair. And again, we're just using burnt umber oil paint as our drawing color here. It may look kind of goofy now because we're trying to place in these shapes, but it's alright. We're just trying to relate each shape to one another, following the principles of proportion, value, and color. Alright, so let's make a mixture of lead white alongside the darker area of tone on the palette. This combination is a little bit, I want to say warmer, and now we're going to make it even a little warmer with the alizarin crimson, and this is going to be the cast shadow on the forehead, and that is the shadow being casted by the hair. And we're going to make it even a little warmer by throwing in some cadmium red into the mixture. And now we're going to have a little bit of a warmer shadow on this area of the forehead. And so we can compare the hues of the shadows now that they're all placed. So the hue on the cast shadow on the forehead on this area right here is warmer than, say, the hue on the form shadow on the side of the face. But as we stated before, the cast shadow on the shoulder is much greener in comparison. The hue is much more green. And so this is how you can compare your hues to one another. And again, we don't have to follow any rules here to make a presentable image. Now, other schools would say paint in spots of color and relate each spot of color in relation to the others, and we kind of broke that rule instead by focusing on each piece at a time, studying them carefully, then moving on to the surrounding pieces and studying them one at a time. And now we're just moving that shadow tone a little bit further to the side plane of the forehead. And now we're going to introduce a halftone or a lighter plane as we move away from the side plane of the forehead. So here we are right about here. We're also encouraging the frontal ridge of the skull. You can see it very clearly mapped out as just a little triangle right here. That's all it is, just a little triangular shape of color, nothing more complicated than that. And with just a little more cadmium red and lead white into this mixture, we're going to be gradating the tones even more. Remember, a gradation just means a subtle change in tone. So this is how we create subtle passages of value and thus create subtle passages of form. So again, it's a little lighter here as we approach the planes that are more perpendicular to the light source. Just gradating the tones a little bit. Now let's take a little bit more of the cadmium red, tiny bit more cadmium red and lead white. Notice that we're still mixing right onto the puddles that are already established on the palette. Now with a little more sap green, we're just neutralizing the warmth of the cadmium red and trying just to get the correct value. So that is a value that's a little bit darker than say the values to the left of this passage, but not as light as the values to the right of this passage of form. And so we're just trying to build a gradation of tone here that kind of makes sense and that kind of follows the form. So anatomically speaking, we're painting in the plane for the frontal ridge of the skull, and you can kind of see it protruding a little further out. So right about here, there's going to be a shape of tone. You can even see it in the photo reference that is a little bit darker, and it creates kind of a triangular looking pattern. Now with the light, almost feather-like touch, we're just going to soften these little edges right about here. So at this point, it's just about softening the edges, and then pretty shortly we're going to get into the top of the head. So now let's look at the, say, the tear ducts to the bottom of the chin. So tear ducts to bottom of the chin is one distance, and we're going to want to relate this distance to that of the top of the hair to the tear ducts. So remember, proportion is all about relation. And now we're going to be just drawing in the shape of the hair. And so another rule that usually goes around is to use the largest brush possible for the job. And I'm going to say that it's more important to understand the information that you're putting down than it is to have a bigger brush, or any kind of brush in particular. And so we're using a very tiny brush here. So this is I think a size 1 round brush that we've been using here with our burnt umber. And one thing you'll kind of notice is that we started off with the angle of the eyes, which again I stated as one of the most important, if not the most important angle to the entire portrait. Established that very early on, then figured out where the eyes fit in relation to one another. Then we figured out the nose, then we figured out the mouth. So we're kind of working in the order of importance, don't you think? So now we've moved on to the hair. And well, the hair is important, and I want to paint the hair as closely as I can to the hair, the actual hair of the model. But in the end of the day, if all I really get right is the hair, might not be a good day, if you know what I mean. So we kind of also worked with the order of importance. So making sure those eyes are in the right place, the nose and the mouth, and of course the jaw and the neck, making sure that all of those shapes fit. And now you can see we're kind of moving very quickly with the outline of the hair. And now we're going to start to get into some more color combinations for blonde hair. And so I've received a lot of questions and suggestions of painting a model with blonde hair. And so the last time I painted a model with blonde hair, there was a lot in shadow. Now there's a lot of shadow in this one too, but you can see a little more of the color or the blonde color. So now we're going to talk about color combinations for blonde hair. Now I see that the blonde hair in general usually has a lot of greens to it, and that's usually the kind of the general principle or the general idea with blonde hair. But we're going to add some kind of different combinations of color here. So you saw we just mixed up burnt umber, white, and yellow ochre. I think burnt umber, white, and then yellow ochre makes a very nice yellow, neutral yellow-ish blonde hair color, so to speak. Now you can see there's a little bit of greenish, but there's still some yellow to these combinations. And so we're just going to be painting in the hair pretty much segment by segment. So we're going to stick to this segment for a little while. And so we're just adding in a little bit of the darker mixtures for this area. Now we're going back onto the palette, just taking what's on the palette, adding a little bit of sap green into this mixture, and just painting in a light plane right there. Just making the edge a little bit soft and darkening the tone in that region. And again, the color combinations are pretty much burnt umber, white, yellow, ochre. And here we're spreading a tone onto this area. And the color that we're painting on top of was the color we used earlier to just mass in that shape. And again, that color was burnt umber. And now we're just introducing a little, some more cooler notes right about here and sharpening this edge on the side of the face. Just adding some more cool tones on this area. So let's take some more lead white and just bring up the value right about here. Now you could paint individual strands of hair if you'd like to with a really tiny brush. And I've done that a few times before, but in this case I'm just going to let the brush strokes suggest the individual strands of hair. So here's another little light plane of hair. You can see that I'm not really trying to copy too much specifics for the actual strands of hair. Rather, I'm looking at the large shape of the hair. And again, I will say, I probably shouldn't say this, but in the end of the day, if all I get right is the hair, then that probably wasn't a good day. So I'm just going to go in with a little more burnt umber and some ivory black and some alizarin crimson. Now, I don't want you to get out of this that I don't care about painting hair. It may seem like that, but I certainly do pay quite a bit of respect to painting hair. And so you can even see that we're tinting in a little bit of a warmer dark into these darker values. Now, alizarin crimson or alizarin permanent or whichever alizarin you're using is a very good tinter. So it's very good for making something dark, warm-ish. So that's why I chose to use alizarin to tint this dark. So this dark color is pretty much just burnt umber, ivory black tinted with alizarin crimson to give me this dark, warm, dark note. And if I had used something like my cadmium red, then that probably would have raised the value of the burnt umber, and I didn't want that. So that's why I used alizarin crimson, which is a little more of a tinting color. Now we're just going to take right from the palette. Again, the color combination is very similar to that of burnt umber, white, and yellow ochre, but it's also influenced with some of the flesh tones. So again, if you're painting a model with blonde hair, you can also take some of the flesh tones right off your palette, and those colors tend to fit in pretty well with the blonde hair. And this area is a little greenish, so we're taking some of the colors right from the palette to create that. And we're thinking about these planes on the hair. Remember, each value change indicates a plane change. So that's the kind of strategy that we're applying to the hair. Just adding in a little darker note. Now we're going to add a lighter note right on top of it just to get the idea of the hair. Let's throw in some more yellow ochre and white. Some more yellow ochre and white, and just get this light strand of the hair. Again, remember, every single value change indicates a plane change, not necessarily the color change, but the value change alone will indicate the plane change. And a little more ultramarine into this mixture, and we're going to just pinch this shape a little darker. Try to pull forward that little strand of hair that we painted. And you can see how it's an abbreviation of the photo reference. So we're not copying the photo reference to try to create the hair. Instead, we're kind of extrapolating information from it. And a little more cadmium red just to raise the value and to create a little bit more warmth into this area of color. So remember, the primary mixture for the light of the hair is pretty much burnt umber, lead white, yellow ochre. And we threw in some sap green in there. But that's the primary mixture for these colors. And the areas that I want to appear more yellowish have more yellow ochre in them than the other areas. Nothing more complicated than that. And you can already tell it's kind of starting to hopefully look like blonde hair. And of course, there are some influences of the flesh tones into these mixtures of color, but nothing more complicated than that. And again, we're just pinching or raising up the value right about here because there's a very nice high lit strand of hair, or a strand of hair that is in highlight. Should I say probably a patch of hair that's in highlight. And we're making these edges pretty soft, if you notice. Very light touch with the hair. Especially closer to the hairline. We really want those edges to be really soft. Now we're going to start to move into the shadow area of the side of the hair. Now you're seeing a little more burnt umber and sap green into the mixture, and we just threw in a little bit of yellow ochre into that. Let's throw in some more sap green and yellow ochre just to get more paint onto this mixture. We want to load the brush with a little more paint. And we're going to use a little bit of Neo McGilp into this mixture. And again, that is my medium. So I use medium to thin out the paint, especially when I want to cover a large passage, such as this one. And so the medium that you use, whatever medium you use, pretty much just use it to thin out the paint. Don't try to use the mineral spirits so much to thin out the paint. Instead, try to use a medium. And again, if you want to know exactly what medium I'm using, I'm going to have the name of that medium typed up in the description box for you. And we just threw in a little more ultramarine blue into that area. We're just trying to push the color change a little bit. So this area is a little cooler, closer to the blue-ish side, but not obviously not bright blue either. And a little more burnt umber into this mixture here. Pretty much just spreading the paint onto the surface. And linen is a really nice surface to work on, especially if you're going to work in this way, because it's super absorbent. It just takes the paint right away. And now we're going to add a little bit of a more of a yellow ochre burnt umber-ish color right about here, and with the intention of painting over it with a lighter, more yellowish mixture of paint. Now we're just adding some ivory black just to push this value change a little bit more. So that's another thing you'll notice with blonde hair, that the darks tend to get really dark. I mean, not always the case, but it is with this particular passage of value. But we're not painting straight black either. So the ivory black is mixed with some of the burnt umber as well. And so now, as mentioned before, we're going to go in with some of our lighter and more yellowish colors. So again, this is pretty much just burnt umber, white, yellow ochre, and a touch of sap green for these mixtures. And that'll give you a very nice blonde-ish type of color for the hair. So we painted in the color, but now we're going to just soften. As you've seen, we just soften the edge a little bit. Now we're going to soften it even further while placing in this darker shape. You really want the edges as you approach the hairline to be really soft. So let's add a little more light right about here. This plane is facing the light a lot more. Think about it as a ribbon. So this portion of the ribbon is receiving a lot of light, and it gets a little darker as it turns away from that area. And just throwing in some more sap green into the mixture, and we're just going to raise the value on this area a little bit with the sap green and the lead white. And I'm painting in a kind of horizontal fashion just to eliminate the glare, because the more paint you use, it will create a little bit more glare, especially if you use a lot of medium. As I said, I did use a little more medium into that area, which then kind of creates a glare. So I'm just trying to get the glare out of there by painting horizontally at times. So now we're pushing the dark shape right about here. So this area of the hair is a plane change, and that is a plane change that's angling further away from the light, and so it's darker. And now as it approaches the light even more, it's going to get lighter. And so again, we're working from that darker shape towards the lighter shapes. And again, using a combination that's no more complicated, as you've seen on the palette, no more complicated than burnt umber white, yellow ochre, and sap green. And again, if you want to know exactly what manufacturer or brand that I'm using for these oil paints, that's all typed up for you in the description box below. And we're just pushing the paint a little further down, observing that this shape is a little bit darker. So just making the shape darker as we roll across the form. And it's a little bit lighter right about here. Remember, I'm painting a little bit, I'm making the brush strokes in a horizontal fashion just because it helps me eliminate glare. And the glare is not as evident on the camera, but from my point of view as I'm painting, it does create quite a glare. Now we're adding a touch more of the cadmium red, so just a little more cadmium red to raise the value and to raise the warmth. And so this area here is going to be quite a bit warmer. So again, not all areas within the blonde hair are going to be yellowish or greenish. There are going to be areas that are warmer. So that's when we use our cadmium red for those warmer and lighter areas. And of course, alizarin for those warmer and darker areas. And the edge between the shadow side of the face and the hair, we really want that edge to be soft as well. So we're going to be softening that edge. And that's to pull focus towards the center of the face. Notice the edge for the contour of the face in the light is painted sharper than the edge of the contour of the face in the shadow. So that's a very intentional edge making decision there. And with a little more ivory black. We're just painting in a darker halftone right about here. And so this area of uh, color in the hair is starting to get too close to the color and value of the neck. So we're going to be kind of making it a little bit darker in these areas right about here. That's why we're using these mixtures. And let's pull in some little strands of hair. So just taking right off the palette, painting in some lighter strands of hair. Notice how we're just pulling a little strand or a little patch of hair right about there. Now we're taking from the halftone to dark light-ish region from the palette with a little more ivory black into that mixture, and we're just filling in this little patch of value. And that patch of value is darker than the form shadow on the neck. Remember I said that value needed to be a little darker, so now we're making it darker. And now we're taking from the halftone region of the palette, pretty much just taking that same color and painting in the little strand of hair. A little more sap green and lead white mixed onto this little region of the palette. We're just going to pull some more strands of hair that are in the light. Nothing more complicated than that. Doesn't take much for the hair to appear like it's in space, so long as you delineate the plane changes on them and make the edges relatively soft. Notice how I'm patting down and making the edges very soft. And now we're going to get into some of our ultramarine blue, and we added a little bit more white, a little more lead white. So ultramarine blue, lead white, and alizarin crimson, so you might be able to see where I'm going with this color mixture. So we're creating something that's kind of purple-ish, which is going to be used for the background. Ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson. And a little bit of ivory black just to bring down the intensity of the saturation of the ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson mixture, which is the very last thing I'm going to want to do to this painting, is just fill in the color for the background. And this video was primarily intended to show you that you can work in pretty much a variety of different methods. And with that, that just about concludes this week's portrait painting demonstration. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that these videos are helping you out, and I'll see you next time.